This episode is supported by LoopNet. LoopNet listed properties are 283% more likely to lease or sell. That's 283% more likely to find a tenant or buyer when listed on LoopNet. Help your commercial property be seen by the right audience at the right time in the right place. Be seen on LoopNet.
LEED has become a widely used rating system around the globe. It's a recognized indicator of leadership, both within our organization and to lay people outside of our industry. And it's really become an indispensable resource for the sustainability buildings community at large. Despite that growth, though, when I look back at what we were 30 years ago and within the context of where we stand today, I really see our role as very much being the same. We are charged with taking these complex, important subject matters where we know the desired end state, but maybe we don't know exactly how to get there, to putting that in an understandable, actionable, and implementable framework for our community. Decarbonization being such an excellent example of this. Not unlike energy efficiency back in the day, the market knows where we need to go. We just don't know exactly how to get there. So we as an organization are putting in this deep critical thought for how we can explain that to people, how we can help them understand how they can get there, and ultimately to be able to enable this swift and strategic action.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of the REIT Report, part of our ongoing series, Building to Zero, which is focused on the real estate industry's journey to reduce emissions from the built environment to zero. I'm Jessica Long, NAREIT's SVP for Environmental Stewardship and Sustainability. Joining me today are Heather Payson and Wes Sullens from the U.S. Green Building Council. Heather is the Director of Standards and Development for USGBC, where her work as a sustainability strategist and advocate is grounded in her dedication to improving the performance of the built environment for people and the planet. Her background and understanding of the architecture, engineering, and construction industry help her to support driving sustainability for large-scale, high-profile, complex projects. Wes is a LEED Fellow and serves as a Director in the LEED Department at USGBC. He leads the organization's technical alignment with LEED and green building codes, including the International Green Construction Code. And his background includes support for progressive green building policies, codes, and standards and legislation, having served as vice chair of the ASHRAE Standard 189.1 Committee for High Performance Green Buildings. And so it's so nice to have you both here today. What an amazing opportunity to talk about what's going on at USGBC and how that is contributing to decarbonization in the built environment. So I have to start by sharing that LEED and USGBC were really instrumental in the growth of my career in sustainability. In my first year working in commercial real estate, I was introduced to LEED through the development team at the real estate firm that I was working at. And it was really clear that this was an organized effort. This wasn't going to be random acts of green, that this was really something that you could base business strategy and decisions on. And I really took to that. And over time, I was able to get approval to implement LEED volume across our portfolio of existing buildings, worked in support of rolling out some of the more performance-based programs that USGBC was working on at the time, and then really got to know the organization during my time serving as the co-chair for Green Build in DC in 2015. And so over that time period and beyond, since up until now, I've really seen USGBC as a leader in this space, a convener of the industry, and really instrumental in helping to spell out step by step what needs to be done to implement sustainability in building and in the commercial real estate industry. So I'm just so excited to talk to you today about some of the things that have come out recently and that we're expecting to see here in the coming years. So I'll start just by asking you your thoughts on USGBC's role in the real estate market, how that's evolved over time, and where you see that going in the future.
Yeah, I would be happy to take that one. And your story is interesting. I hear that from so many people that I talk to about USGBC and LEED and how it's become such an integral part of their journey through sustainability, both today and formerly. And the way you described it really captures my perspective on our historical role as an organization and where we're headed. When USGBC was founded over 30 years ago and the first version of LEED was released, it really established that clear and understandable framework to measure and define what at the time, green buildings were, providing that market with that holistic system for reducing environmental impacts, conserving resources, safeguarding human health, reducing carbon emissions, and just addressing climate change on a macro scale. We really provided that framework for the first time to be able to understand, describe, and measure that. Fast forward 30 years later, today, LEED has become a widely used rating system around the globe. It's a recognized indicator of leadership, both within our organization and to lay people outside of our industry. And it's really become an indispensable resource for the sustainability buildings community at large. Despite that growth, though, when I look back at what we were 30 years ago and within the context of where we stand today, I really see our role as very much being the same. We are charged with taking these complex, important subject matters where we know the desired end state, but maybe we don't know exactly how to get there, to putting that in an understandable, actionable, and implementable framework for our community. Decarbonization being such an excellent example of this. Not unlike energy efficiency back in the day, the market knows where we need to go. We just don't know exactly how to get there. So we as an organization are putting in this deep critical thought for how we can explain that to people, how we can help them understand how they can get there, and ultimately to be able to enable this swift and strategic action. So I guess in summation, while our audience is much larger today and seemingly growing by the minute, our role is essentially the same: to keep pushing that framework forward, to keep encompassing these emerging topics, to create these actionable pathways, and to empower our community to strive for leadership.
I think that's so great. That's really on point with a lot of what we talk about with our members at NAREIT is this moment in time where we're moving from voluntary to regulated, and it really redefines what leadership is. Wes, did you want to add anything? I know you have this background in kind of the more of the policy and the regulation side of things. How do you see this changing, especially in your role at USGBC?
It really has changed. When LEED first came out, 25, 26 years ago, it really was a market leader. Some of our early customers were the government agencies and things. But now, as we know, fast forward to 2024, there's just so much going on in this space, and the urgency is greater than ever. And so we always have to balance this urgency of what the market needs with what's possible. And things like policy help establish a floor, and they're even more and more doing so a ceiling. And so with LEED, it's become, I think, even more challenging to straddle what does leadership mean in these times. And that's really what we use our group of volunteers and experts. We're a nonprofit that has lots and lots of volunteers that help us write our rating system. It's not something we cook up in a vacuum. And the idea is to make sure LEED is that consensus standard for leadership, which I think is a unique place in the market. And LEED is our flagship, but we also do things like provide education and resources, like some reports, and of course, convenings like our Greenbelt Conference, and focus thought leadership on topics like schools and indoor air quality and equity and decarbonization, of course, and lots of other topics. I guess what I would say is where we're all today is there's just lots of activity in this space. And as much as possible, we're trying to convene and collaborate with partners to scale and have bigger impact than ever before, because it is so urgent that we address these challenges of our times.
Couldn't agree more. There's so much to tackle, and the more resources and support and training that we can provide to the whole ecosystem of the real estate industry is what is needed. So can you share a little bit about some of the recent reports that you guys have published? So we have the State of Building Decarbonization and a report on embodied carbon. I think both of these provide a lot of great context for the market. So could you share a little bit about the impetus behind producing those reports and some of the highlights that readers could find if they wanted to dig in further?
Absolutely. I'll kick things off talking about the State of Decarbonization report, and then Wes is sort of our subject matter expert on the topic of embodied carbon. I'll flip it to you for that piece of it. The State of Building Decarbonization report was produced in collaboration with AREP. We released it at COP28 in Dubai in December of 2023. And essentially, it is a very deeply researched snapshot of the U.S. commercial real estate sector, very specific to the U.S., largely focused on operational carbon. We do touch on embodied carbon within that report, but as you mentioned, there's a sort of sister report to it that dives much more deeply into that same concept. And it is jam-packed with information. It covers a lot of statistics and visualizations around the subject matter and exploration of levers that are available for us to hopefully drive this decarbonization forward. I certainly cannot do it justice in a quick snapshot here, but I'm happy to talk about some of the things that I found most interesting in it. It's even great as a USGBC employee to be able to engage with our own resources to educate ourselves. So it was something that I really appreciated being put into very simple and very understandable concepts. One not technical element of it that I appreciated was I think anyone could pick the report up up and understand what it's talking about and what it means within their context. You do not need to be a building sciences expert. You do not need to be an engineer, an architect, or even in our field. It really paints a picture very clearly and as simple as one can with the sort of subject matter. So big takeaways that I took away from it that I found most interesting are that we actually have achieved a relatively significant feat of having the US commercial stock emissions really stabilized to about 1990 levels, in spite of the fact that we have increased our gross square footage about 55% over that same period of time. So we see that really significant accomplishment in terms of energy efficiency and less carbon intensive assets, but we also have a lot of work to do to continue to drive those same levels down. So as you'll see, as you go through the report, there's a lot of things that are coupled with, okay, we're doing great, but we need to do more. One great example there is the report highlights the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the incentives that are available through that, really emphasizing what a significant mechanism that can be to help us propel the industry in the correct direction, as long as we are actually engaging with it. We have to use those funds and we have to use them strategically to make sure that we're realizing the potential that could come out of them. And when we think about that and we think about where those funds need to be applied, one of the pieces that I felt the report really clearly laid out that probably doesn't come across when we talk about decarbonization at a nationwide scale is that in the US, we have a vast variability across the country in where we are at on this journey. So it digs into some of the elements of that are really crucial to be considering, especially as an owner, an investor, if you have a portfolio that's distributed throughout the country versus nestled in certain areas of the country, knowing things like the variability in code adoption. While some states have very stringent building codes and building performance standards for their existing assets, some are still referencing codes and standards that are over 10 years old. With more than half the US states referencing codes from 2013 or earlier, there's some pretty obvious ways that we can start to push forward efficiency just through those basic mechanisms. It also talks about the variable carbon intensity of the grid, something that you may not have control over, but can contribute towards improving and should certainly be aware of. And then lastly, something that really resonated to me was the variability in data availability. So there was one stat in there that says only 1% of commercial assets in the US are subject to benchmarking policies, which personally blew my mind. Benchmarking is such a hugely important part of this journey. There is the old adage that I will not quit. You cannot manage what you do not measure. If we don't know what we're consuming, how can we begin addressing that? I started my career out working in New York City with a huge focus on Local Law 84, which is part of the Greener Greater Buildings legislation that required benchmarking for all assets of 50,000 square feet or over. I was actually engaging on the ground with owners, helping them try to understand what utility bills they had, where they lived. We found crazy things. People were paying their neighbors' meters for certain fuels. People didn't know all the different accounts that were associated with their projects. It was such a tremendous knowledge building experience that to think that only 1% of the country is mandated to that, just wild to me. So hoping that we can really push that forward and use that as a mechanism to better understand our assets, improve our assets, and then also to be able to allow jurisdictions to put in place mechanisms like BPS that can help guide us in that direction in hopefully a more expeditious manner. The report also touches on crucial levers for decarbonization, electrification, retrocommissioning, some other wild stats in the report about retrocommissioning, about 0.6% adoption last year. If we had actually achieved a 1% market adoption, we could save roughly 4 billion kBTU, 830,000 tons of CO2 per year or CO2e per year. Small efforts that can make a huge change. And then from a less technical perspective, and something that's probably interesting to your listeners, the report talks a lot about corporate commitments and specific to REITs that we're seeing roughly a quarter of the largest US-based REITs have serious decarbonization commitments. For me, that's just a tremendous indicator of the urgency, the collective urgency that we're feeling, the market awareness of what's happening here. And now we really just need to couple those with action and accountability. So while I really just scratched the surface of what's in the report there, I really recommend engaging with it. At the end of the day, it's just a really powerful call to deploy proven solutions that we need to be moving faster. We need to be moving more collectively if we're going to hit our domestic and global carbon commitments.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really encourage people to download the report, take a look. A lot of great insights, especially want to highlight that it's readable for the layman. You don't have to be a sustainability expert. Sometimes we do get in a little bit of a real estate sustainability bubble and we're throwing around a lot of jargon and a lot of technical terms, but having information that can be absorbed by the broader economy and market is really important. And also, that we want to celebrate this progress. All of the work that's been done, it has meant something, and we are moving in the right direction. And it feels a little hard sometimes to be in this industry, in this space. Sometimes I've given a lot of pep talks to peers and colleagues lately, but it's making a difference. And that last point you just made shows that even the small actions have big impacts. And it may feel like, oh, this one project on this one building isn't going to make a difference. We're so far behind, but it does. It really does make a difference. And I think we are in a really good place on operational carbon. I think we know a lot more than we did 25 years ago. Not saying we have it all figured out yet, but we know the recipe, we know the formula to reduce operational carbon. And really now it's about, again, directing those funds, making the projects pencil, and making sure that we're talking about that great work and attracting that capital that wants to do good to reduce that carbon. I'll say on the flip side, embodied carbon, a little bit more challenging. We're in the earlier days on that journey. Wes, what can you share with us around insights on this side of the journey?
That's exactly right, Jessica. We are on the more of the front end of the learning curve for embodied carbon. And so what we did in September of last year, September 2023, was we released a report in collaboration with RMI, who really have been working on decarbonization for a long time, probably longer than almost anyone, especially on energy, but they've really got expertise in embodied carbon for the last 10 years or more. And so they're a kind of an international think tank and just great research partners. And we put our heads together and just said, what do we want to get out of this state? Let's have a state of the industry report. It's called Driving Action on Embodied Carbon in Buildings. That's the title. And we really want to do the similar outcomes of the decarb report you just heard about from Heather, which is distill the science down into some meaningful takeaways. There's been lots and lots of research and reports, and it feels like embodied carbon is just everywhere now, just studies and science around it. So how can we take the best of that and cut through the noise and figure out what is the state of the science and how can we make actions based on that? The next kind of goal of our report was to enhance embodied carbon literacy. Whereas for energy efficiency and renewables and things like that, we've had 40 plus years for the whole industry to get up to speed on those topics, and there's a lot of savviness around there. Embodied carbon is still new, and there's lots of acronyms and terms thrown around, and of course, the science and things. So we tried to distill that down into what are the meaningful takeaways. And the third sort of outcome of that report is to inform LEED version 5, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But how can we take the state of the industry and place those into the rating system that is going to be the next version of LEED? And so by doing all that, we uncovered some very interesting things. Embodied carbon emissions from buildings are about 11% of global GHG emissions. And I should say at least 11%, because that's the part that's most easy to count. There's a lot of things that are harder to count, like interior renovations and churn through office renovations. Those don't tend to show up in a lot of the reports that look at concrete and steel and more in-place structural materials. Well, we know that 11% is a large number, and it's only going to grow as buildings decarbonize and their energy and their operations emissions go down. The slice of the pie attributed to embodied carbon is only going to grow. Another big finding we found was that about anywhere from 50 to 85% of embodied carbon comes from those upfront emission stages during product manufacturing and extraction. So while there can be things that happen to materials and embodied carbon through the life of the building, or even at end of life, depending if a building's torn down or renovated or sent to the landfill, the materials, really what matters the most are those emissions from the creation of those products that get installed. The concrete, the furnaces that make your steel, how the concrete Portland cement is created. Things like that have a larger impact than any of the others, and they're most attributed to manufacturers, which are the ones that have a big role to play in driving down emissions of the manufacturing sector. So that was a big takeaway, that let's look up front at those first stage emissions, what's called in the LCA world, life cycle assessment world, stages A1 to A3, A4, A5, et cetera. We also know that while there may be gaps in the science or the data may be limited in some ways, we have enough information to make meaningful impacts today. We know that the big sources of emissions tend to be from those structural materials. We know the churn of offices and finishes that are high carbon, like flooring and others, can add up to a lot of emissions year over year. So we have the data to make informed decisions, even though we may not have all of the counting of the beans actually completely right. And then in terms of literacy, there are lots and lots of terminology out there, things like whole building LCA, you hear a lot about, and the difference between that's whole building life cycle assessment, as opposed to whole life carbon assessment. Those are two very competing and important discussions. And we get into detail on what those two mean. So I don't want to bore you with it right here, but there's some great things to find in that report. The report's also laid out as we basically asked 11 questions of ourselves or of the industry. How big of an opportunity is embodied carbon? What should we prioritize, operational or embodied emissions first? The answer is both. How do I measure it? Is the data good enough? Questions like this. And we get into some that are more specific. Can wood products help benefit the climate? And is carbon storage of building materials really possible? And then we even have a section at the end on the policy landscape and how things are different perhaps in other places around the world, like in Europe, where they're even farther ahead and have been addressing embodied carbon for longer than us here in the States. That report is available along with the one Heather shared on advancing decarbonization. They're both on our website. You can Google search them, or we can put links to the podcast. Just to encourage your audience to please read those. I think they're accessible and should be very helpful.
Wes, you highlighted one thing in there that I wanted just to zoom in on a little bit for a second, is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're still learning a lot around operational carbon emissions, body carbon emissions, how they all work together, what they mean on an individual asset versus portfolio level across the country, across the globe. But we know a lot now, and we know enough to start taking action, to start planning, to start calibrating our investments accordingly. We're asking the world to look at, their assets and their long-term planning for those assets differently. We will continue to learn more over time, but that doesn't mean that you can't start taking action and start planning now. If we wait to figure it out, it will be too late. So make sure that we're capitalizing on what we know today and building that into our everyday practices so it becomes a part of our everyday operations on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important that we start incorporating this language into our industry. We start educating the people that maybe have not been looking at or not as well informed on this topic, start bringing folks up to speed as we move in that direction. I think that one of the key points that you hit on is really that we can make some progress now. And I think that's tied a lot to material selection and things that you can do in the design process to think about this up front. But getting all the way to zero is really going to involve new building techniques and technologies and materials that we may not currently use or use in large projects like mass timber and things like that, but also looking to the manufacturer of steel, concrete, glass, and looking to the manufacturers of those products. And I will say, I've been encouraged as I look at some of the discussion that's happening at the global level on building decarbonization of the built environment, that you do have these industries at the table and they are having these conversations. Again, getting outside of that commercial real estate bubble, understanding that the industries that are adjacent to our industry are on their own journeys, and we have this intersection. I have separate episodes that we're doing talking about the utility sector. I think the building materials sector is a huge partner in this journey for real estate, and we need to make sure that we're talking to each other, we're monitoring that progress so we can understand where our journeys are going and how we can get there. Because the reality is, like you said, the ability to capture all of the materials that are going into buildings, whether it be refurbishments and tenant build outs or new construction. And we know that with population growth, and especially in the global South, we're going to see more construction. It's not like we're not going to be building buildings. We need to continue to develop and improve the built environment with this eye and understanding on the carbon emissions that are embedded in that process.
This episode is supported by LoopNet. LoopNet listed properties are 283% more likely to lease or sell. That's 283% more likely to find a tenant or buyer when listed on LoopNet. Help your commercial property be seen by the right audience at the right time in the right place. Be seen on LoopNet.
So really just, again, appreciative of the work. Look forward to continuing to see those reports make their way through the industry and have folks better understand and incorporate that into their work. So to that end, you mentioned LEED. I'd say this is probably USGBC's most well-known product, the flagship certification. So can you share a little bit about what is happening with LEED V5? I think that we're excited to see where this goes. And also, I know that there's been a robust process of engagement with the industry. Some of our members have been on the working groups and steering committees that have been involved in this. So I think this is an exciting time for folks that use LEED or look to LEED for that leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. LEED V5 is definitely a really exciting topic for us as an organization right now. And I think generally for the industry, it's just something it's coming at a really important time. And essentially where we're at in the development process is we just closed our first public comment period. So we released 4 versions of the rating system for public comment in early April. That's the new construction rating system, commercial interiors, existing buildings, and core and shell. So all of those were opened up for public comment in April. We received a little over 5,000 public comments, which was really encouraging for us, hearing a lot from the market. Just great to see that level of market engagement given how long it's been since the last version of LEED was released. But since 4 and 4.1 came out, it has been really an ongoing development effort working with all of these technical advisory groups, our LEED steering committees. We stood up 2 new working groups for the development of LEED version 5, one specifically focused on equity and one specifically focused on resilience. So it's been a long, ongoing iterative process from internal staff and volunteers and additional subject matter experts that were engaged. We are now in the process of going through all of those public comments, responding to them, evolving the rating system as a result of those. And then that will be released for a second public comment period early in the fall. And so hopefully, once we get through that and get that out, it will be out very soon in 2025 for use by the public to be able to register. And we're really striving to get that out there in that time frame because a huge part of the objective with LEED v5 has been to deliver a rating system that is immediately valuable to the market upon release and really becomes a practical and actionable tool for people to implement, whether that's around things like decarbonization and embodied carbon specifically, or if it's about quality of life and responding to a lot of the increased resilience events that we've been seeing on a global basis and how we can be changing our design, construction, operation of assets accordingly. A lot has changed and a lot has changed quickly, which is really exciting. And we want to be able to arm our community with resources to be able to respond to that effectively and efficiently. On a high level, we have structured this version of the rating system around 3 core impact areas, quality of life and ecosystem conservation and restoration, being identified as really the 3 areas where LEED can and must have an impact. And figuring out how we can help educate the market in those areas and matriculate them through that education to lead to constructive action at the individual asset level. So we're very excited to have that in the process. Along with LEED version 5, we also announced that we will be moving to a 5-year development cycle. So if we release V5 in 2025, V6 will come in 2030. That's allowed us to really develop V5 while thinking about V6 and thinking about how we can put in foundational concepts that we can then build on and get help bring the market with us through these concepts and within these frameworks that we're establishing. It's an exciting time within the organization from several perspectives, but I'm really optimistic to see how the market is able to engage with the rating system, the various versions of it, and really the change that we're able to yield at scale as a result of that.
That's really exciting. I really like the 3 themes. 3 is a good, easy number. And I think that 5-year cycle is really important. And there may be some initial thought like, oh my gosh, that's so soon to have changes. But one thing that we're recognizing is, especially with the focus on decarbonization and adapting to climate change, that 5 years is a long time these days. And we're moving so swiftly towards some of these interim milestones and targets on our path to net zero. And we're seeing the changes happening in real time to the climate. And so I think it's so important that we're constantly refreshing and recalibrating and seeing, again, what is needed and what is possible.
Yeah, and especially in this version, we're seeing this huge need for education and alignment across the industry. I think from the development perspective, it's really important not to leapfrog right to that end state. We need to show people how to get there and make sure that we're all using common nomenclature and have a common understanding of what the methodology is. And so that 5-year cadence allows us to step our community through that process as opposed to trying to rush to the finish line without showing them how to get there.
And I'd say that's been built into LEED going back to the beginning, this sort of having the top tiers of the rating system, which is our platinum and gold, the kind of top levels, being reserved for those real market leaders, those folks that are truly decarbonizing their buildings as much as they can, as much as is possible today. But then also having some entry points for those projects that maybe can't do everything or have a tighter timeline or whatnot, for whatever reason, they're just starting. And that's where the LEED certified and silver levels come in. And our theory of change there is that leadership really drives itself. And that's why the 5-year cycle is so important. Folks see someone as in the leadership position. They want to, hopefully, there's either pride or envy drives them to want to do the same thing. And then all of a sudden, you've got someone else in leadership position a couple of years later. And that means we need to recalibrate the bar. We have to change those thresholds. And that really is how we spend a lot of time thinking about what's possible, what's state of the art, and what's accessible today. What are the big needs? And that's where things like literacy around carbon, decarbonization. I think the first step on this version and LEED version 5, you're going to see a lot of education and awareness around assessing your carbon impacts. All projects will need to assess how much carbon are we emitting, both operational wise, direct emissions on site, indirect through our supply chain, through materials, transportation, et cetera. There's carbon assessment as part of the requirements of LEED version 5. And that's to enable everyone to start speaking that same language and getting a similar yardstick. But for those that are already doing that and way ahead and going down the science-based target lines or looking to the Paris Climate Accords, we have pathways for you too. We've got decarbonization pathways that get into electrification of buildings. We've got reduction of embodied carbon. We've got lots and lots. We can talk more about it in detail perhaps. But really the idea is with LEED is over time, it is a moving and shifting rating system that's meant to transform the building itself, but also push the market towards more and better transformation. That's why those 5-year cycles are so important.
I do want to dig in a little deeper on decarbonization specifically. This is an area that we're spending a lot of time with our members as well as real estate investors and REIT and private real estate investors that are looking to align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement, with climate science in a 1.5 degree scenario. And I think there's been a lot of progress, a lot of movement in understanding what we mean by that. But I think there's still a lot to be desired in that discussion as far as what are the metrics? How can you measure a building's performance against a trajectory towards net zero and really tied to the science of climate change? Can you talk a little bit more about how V5 is going to support the industry in that way and how that was taken into account in the process that you've gone through so far?
Yeah, in terms of how it came into play, as I mentioned, we have those 3 core areas of focus, those 3 impact areas determined by our lead steering committee and our volunteer community of where we need to have that focus. Not surprisingly, decarbonization bubbled to the top of that conversation. I don't think that shocked anyone of the emphasis there, but we did further get the direction from our committees that across those 3 goals, about 50% of our effort should be allocated towards decarbonization, and the remaining 50 split between those other 2 in terms of quality of life and ecosystem conservation and restoration. So again, really showing where that emphasis is. And I think as Wes and I have both mentioned a couple of times, there's a huge emphasis on carbon literacy and education. LEED has played many different roles throughout its lifetime, whether that is a verifying body, an educational body. We really see a huge element of this educational body being part of our responsibility here. When we talk about the approaches, in my mind, I really split it into 2 very specific beasts, one being existing buildings and everything else that's new. Existing buildings are, of course, going to be a massive part of this effort to decarbonize. They're also significantly challenging and more complex than building a new decarbonized asset from the start. For these existing assets, we're putting a massive emphasis on decarbonization planning. The more specifically, frankly, strategic decarbonization planning. These efforts have started in the industry, and we are seeing a wide array in the quality and utility of those decarb plans. So trying to help folks understand who should be involved in those conversations, what that planning process looks like, and how you can go about putting together a plan for your individual asset. Simple things like requiring all projects to put together a current facilities requirement and an operations and maintenance plan, measuring those energy sources, as I had mentioned previously, starting to look at your refrigerants, inventorying and tracking those pieces, and also doing a basic end use breakdown for the asset. What types of systems are in your building and how does that actually come into the planning process? It's a surprisingly more nascent practice than you might expect in the building industry, trying to get these sort of best practices in place. That's at the prerequisite level. From there, we will actually be rewarding projects for putting these long-term plans into place, committing to capital plans over a 5-year span, and then actually moving their asset in that direction. Ultimately, really driving towards electrification and continuing to reward strong performance against things like thermal load management. Increased efficiency is, of course, still part of the program there, and moving towards increased clean power. So that's at the existing building level. Just the act of putting a quality plan in place brings so much to light and allows so many important conversations to be had, and also to engage people that maybe have not historically been a huge part of this planning process. Decarbonization, making a business case for decarbonization is very different than making a business case for energy efficiency. And putting together that long-term plan and integrating that into your financial planning means that we need to have people involved that have the focus on that financial planning, on that long-term CapEx, and starting to bring that into the conversation in a way that we haven't seen previously. That's one very specific path. Then, of course, we have new buildings. And for those buildings, we're really asking people to put that framework in place from day one. That existing building stock is going to be a significant obstacle. It's really critical that these new buildings are designed either to be decarbonized now or ready to be decarbonized when the grid catches up. I like to think of it as every single new building is going to become an existing building the day it becomes occupied. So we cannot continue allowing that challenge to build up more and then ultimately having to have these deep retrofits for assets where we could have controlled it from the start. So for those rating systems, core and shell new construction, I really think one of the most interesting things about V5 is that when you look at the rating system, it is not a set of individual credits and prerequisites. It's really this framework that we put together with intelligent thought behind it of when you think about building a new building, what are the different elements that you need to be driving towards? Reducing fuel from on-site combustion, obviously a very significantly emphasized strategy. Understanding that there's variability both domestically and internationally around the feasibility from a technology standpoint, as well as ultra cold temperatures, et cetera. Building in some pathways for those projects, again, to be on that path to decarbonization, coupling that with concepts related to renewable energy sources. Of course, reducing our peak heating and cooling loads as we shift toward this electrified state, whether it's for buildings, but also for cars and factories. And as we're moving our existing buildings over to an electrified state, we're really changing the way that we interact with the grid. Being cognizant of that and the impact that those buildings will have on the grid, and how we'll either have to change the way the buildings are designed and constructed, or have to go even further with how we're changing the existing grid. And then, of course, looping in, as I mentioned, refrigerants. We're seeing a lot more conversation around refrigerants, big educational area for us, trying to bring that into that decarbonization conversation. And of course, that continued prominence of energy efficiency. It is, while we're all talking about carbon these days, it is just still such an essential part to both getting there to our ultimate end state, but also making progress while maybe it doesn't make sense from a capital perspective to be moving all the way at this point for one reason or another. So that's really specific to operational carbon. We do also tackle transportation-related carbon emissions in the rating system through things like electric vehicles and driving projects to be built in dense locations with existing connectivity, what have you. And then, of course, there's, and Wes, I'll cue this one over to you, huge focus on embodied carbon and bringing that into the equation and looking at all of those together. As Wes mentioned, looking at that projection of how all of these different emission sources act and how they act over time, because you only have certain inflection points to make certain impacts. Akin to what Wes is mentioning with some of those major structural materials, you're not changing those 10 years after the project's built. That's a decision that's done once it's been made.
Yeah, and just drilling in on that embodied carbon. In LEED version 5, we're looking to have a prerequisite that everyone has to do to assess the embodied carbon of those major materials, structural, and if it's an interiors project, commercial interiors, then also the major furnishings and finishes that are in there. Then we're looking for credits that reward project teams for basically picking the low-hanging fruit of embodied carbon. If you can get a 5 or 10% reduction in your concrete or your steel or whatnot, let's make it so every project gets that and you get a couple points and really drive that broad adoption of those off-the-shelf kind of technologies. But we also want to encourage changing the way products and materials are made and manufactured. We know that'll take more time. And in supporting things like the Inflation Reduction Act and others that are investing in low-carbon materials and locally produced, we can give points for going above and beyond those sort of low-hanging fruit and getting deep reduction in carbon for embodied emissions from materials. So you'll see points that span that sort of the starting for just, again, the prerequisite, having everyone assess their carbon, to picking the low-hanging fruit and going deep into reductions. There's a lot of associated benefits from things like building reuse. The lowest carbon building is the one that you don't need to build new materials to build, and fostering reuse markets so that there's more ability to reuse materials and salvage them and use them on a next project, and also reducing waste. Once you do have a project that needs some renovation or some demolition, how can we get those into circular systems that recover the value of those materials and the carbon of those materials indefinitely? So those are all strategies you'll see in the rating system that address embodied carbon. And it really is, we're trying to be holistic, practical, and shifting the market towards the best-in-class strategies we want to see.
I love that. I love that word holistic. You literally took it right out of my brain, because that really is, I think, the way that we have to be thinking about it, because decisions that we make have an impact. New construction versus adaptive reuse, transportation centric focused development versus the more sprawling and suburban. And I don't think we always think big picture on our role in the real estate industry and how some of those decisions actually are impacting sustainability and climate across all industries, because we talk a lot about how real estate touches every aspect of our lives, where we live, where we work, where we play, where we vacation. And we want to make sure that not only are those decisions that have a sustainability consideration to them, but also that we're recognizing and rewarding when those things are happening. And I think sometimes it gets played off a little bit. And I appreciate that LEED has always given that opportunity to reward some of the things that may seem small, but a point is something, right? It's something towards those that might be taking a project from a lower level to a higher level, as you said, or it might be something that gets a project that otherwise couldn't have done, maybe couldn't have been LEED certified to get there. So I think that's really important. So I'll kind of close it out with one last question for you guys. What do you see as the building owners and investors' most important area to influence sustainability in the built environment and this climate action and decarbonization that we've been talking about? I think a lot of times there's the perception that the building owner is driving all the decision making. And while I think ultimately who's funding the project is making a lot of the decisions, but I think a lot of the things that are impacting sustainability are happening throughout the industry and in a lot of these different roles and responsibilities across the building sector. What is your advice to the building owner or investor that is really focused on low carbon, sustainable buildings and the actions that they can be taking that are going to have the most impact?
There are two things that come right to mind for me. One is this importance of planning. We're talking about in some cases, major physical and capital projects that are going to bring these projects towards decarbonization. And that warrants taking a very close look at what you have, when that needs to be replaced, how we can replace it, what incentives might be available, and being able to make these really informed decisions, both from a technical building sciences perspective, as well as a capital expenditure perspective. It requires this really close look. And that's something that I think decarbonization has driven home more than any concept that we've looked at historically, especially because making the business case for decarbonization can be more complex and require more levers to be considered there. Empowering your teams to take that step back and to take that look and allow these strategies to inform your long-term investment decisions, as opposed to assuming that it can be picked up during your typical operations, what have you. This takes careful planning. It takes careful achievement of targets. It takes, honestly, continuously recalibrating where we're at in terms of the need for decarbonization, the specific grid within your region, the useful life of your equipment, the available incentives, all of these things. There's so many components that you really need to give it the attention and consideration that it deserves. And it's not something that's going to be able to be done quick on the back of an envelope and decide that we're going to move forward. Giving your teams that grace also to learn something new and understanding the magnitude of importance associated with it. That's probably the biggest thing that comes to mind for me. And then hearkening back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is not going to be distilled down to something that's incredibly simple that can, tell you exactly what to do. We're going to need to continue to look at the available information, to recalibrate how we're understanding our goals and our progress towards those goals, and to be able to have different priorities driving how we're, moving the built environment towards a state of decarbonization. So it's certainly a new way to be considering sustainability. And I really encourage, especially owners, investors, get involved in the conversation. Be proactive, not reactive. Don't be the people that are left behind knowing that you've missed an opportunity or replacing in-kind equipment when you could be making a meaningful transition towards this state. So really changing the way that we think about this and the way that we bring it into everyday business decisions in the real estate sector.
I would add to that, I think that's excellent. The owners and investors really have, as you mentioned, they don't always call all the shots, but they do call a lot of them early on. And this industry is getting really savvy. There's a lot of really expert and important granular data and experts out there that know how to count these things. I think one of the things that's most important is that when you say you have a decarbonized portfolio or you're working towards it, to have a recognized label like LEED that helps you prove that and back up those claims. Because there's lots and lots of lofty goals out there that folks are making, but maybe they're a little off, or maybe in a few years they'll realize that they're changing course or changing direction a little bit. But when you rely on something like LEED, where we do have the decades of experience and our volunteers, which are true market leaders in helping advise us on what is the next most critical things we can do for the next 5 years at a time, it does hopefully help to mitigate some of those risks that by acting on these decarbonization goals and looking at climate risk, that LEED can be a tool that's recognized internationally to help you get to those goals. So I know it's a shameless plug, but there is truly a role for verification of these claims because it's just kind of the Wild West out there in some ways. And I think there's a big role for owners and investors to really look to frameworks that bring the most out of these buildings and don't just add to the noise, but add to the science and make things real and permanent reductions.
Yeah, that's great advice. I really appreciate it. This was an excellent insights into some of the work happening at USGBC and what the market can expect coming forward here in the years to come. So I'll thank you both for joining us today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica.
To our listeners, if you enjoyed this discussion and are interested in learning more about REIT sustainability, check out nareit.com/sustainability, where we highlight efforts across the REIT industry to deliver strategic initiatives that create value and drive the long-term sustainability in the built environment. If you would like to hear more about what is happening across the REIT industry, you can subscribe to the REIT Report or leave a review wherever you access your podcasts.